Level 1. The Schola. You are assigned to the Medicae track in your second week of basic training, pulled aside along with 11 other recruits after a preliminary aptitude test nobody explained the purpose of beforehand. The instructor running the Medicae Schola tells your group plainly that most of you will not make it through the course, and that the ones who do will spend their careers keeping other men's blood inside their bodies under conditions no lecture hall can properly prepare you for. The training itself is a strange mix of anatomy lessons and applied violence. You learn to pack a wound while an instructor fires blank rounds past your ear to simulate the noise you will actually be working under. Learn to find a pulse on a moving man being dragged across broken ground. Learn the specific weight and balance of a meaty pack loaded with counterseptic vials, sutures, and stim injectors that cost the Munitorum more than your entire kit combined. Nobody pretends the equipment will be plentiful once you reach the front. You are taught, from the first week, to stretch supplies that were never generous to begin with. The course's final assessment happens in a mocked-up trench system. 3 simulated casualties bleeding out on a timer while gunfire recordings blast from speakers mounted along the walls. You save 2 of the 3 within the time limit, and the instructor grading you notes, without much warmth, that the one you lost would have died regardless given the wound, and that recognizing which casualties are already beyond saving is as much a part of the job as saving the ones who are not. A recruit 2 benches over fails the same assessment twice, freezing both times at the sight of the mock casualty's arterial bleed, and washes out of the Medicae track entirely by the following week, reassigned to a standard infantry company without ceremony. You watch him go and understand, more clearly than any lecture managed to explain it, that this course is not really testing whether you know the anatomy. It is testing whether your hands will still function when a person's life depends on them functioning correctly, under conditions built to make that as difficult as possible. You graduate 3 weeks later with a red cross stenciled onto your helmet and a meaty pack that will not leave your side for the rest of your service, assigned to a line infantry company as its junior field medic, standing in a formation of soldiers who will, from this point forward, look at you differently than they look at each other. Level 2. First Blood. Your regiment ships out within the month, and your first real casualty arrives less than an hour into your first firefight. A trooper caught by shrapnel from a mortar round during the opening exchange on a rain-soaked agri-world. You reach him under fire, dragging your kit low across open ground the way the Schola drilled into you, and the wound in front of you looks nothing like the clean training models back home. Real shrapnel tears unevenly. Real blood does not stop where the anatomy charts suggested it would. Your hands move anyway, packing the wound, applying pressure, working through the sequence your body has already memorized, even while the rest of you is still catching up to what is happening. He survives long enough to reach the Medicae point behind the lines, and the senior medic there, a veteran of 2 prior campaigns, tells you afterward that your work bought him the time the surgeons needed. It is the only praise you receive that day, and it lands harder than you expect it to. The senior medic keeps you close for the rest of the campaign, correcting your technique in the field between engagements, teaching you shortcuts the Schola never covered because the Schola was training recruits, not soldiers who would actually need to move fast under real fire. You learn to read a wound at a glance, to triage 3 casualties in the time it takes to say their names, to work with one hand while the other keeps your own lasgun within reach, because a medic who cannot briefly defend a casualty is a medic who loses them both. By the campaign's end, you have treated more wounded men than you can individually remember, and something in you has settled into the rhythm of it. Not comfort exactly, but a working relationship with the chaos that lets your hands stay steady even when the rest of the situation is not. You write letters home for 2 men whose injuries mean they will not be writing any themselves for a while, a task nobody assigns you, and that has quietly become part of what your company expects from its medic, the same way they expect you to know which vein to find in the dark. Level 3. The Triage Line. 18 months into your service, your company takes part in an assault on a fortified position that produces more casualties in 20 minutes than your first campaign produced in its opening month, and you find yourself running a triage line for the first time without a senior medic standing over your shoulder to check your judgment. 6 wounded men arrive at your position within the same 10 minutes, and the decisions in front of you are no longer about technique. They are about order. about which of 6 suffering men gets your hands first, and which have to wait, bleeding, while you work on someone else. You learn the actual weight of the lesson from your final assessment at the Schola, the one about recognizing wounds beyond saving. Standing over a trooper whose injuries you know, within seconds of looking at him, exceed what your kit or your skill can address in the time available. You move past him to the next casualty, a decision that will sit with you longer than almost anything else from that day, and you learn that this specific kind of certainty, knowing exactly where your effort is best spent, and acting on it without hesitating, is itself a skill nobody can teach you faster than the field does. 4 of the 6 survive because of decisions you made in roughly 90 seconds each, working faster and more precisely than you believed yourself capable of only a year earlier. Your company's captain mentions the triage line specifically in his after-action report, a detail that means little in terms of paperwork and considerably more in terms of how the rest of your company starts treating you, less like the newest addition to the unit and more like the reason several of them are still in it. You carry the memory of the man you moved past that day for longer than you carry almost anything else from the assault, replaying the 90 seconds of that decision more times than you would admit to anyone. A chaplain attached to your battalion finds you the following week, sitting alone outside the Medicae tent, and tells you something you did not expect to hear from a man whose job is mostly about the dead. He tells you that grief measured out correctly, in the time you actually have for it, is not weakness, and that the alternative, carrying all of it forward unprocessed, is what actually breaks medics who last long enough to see real numbers of casualties. You do not fully believe him that week. You find yourself believing him more, gradually, across the campaigns that follow. Level 4, the Void Bay. Your regiment transfers to fleet duty in your 3rd year, and you spend 6 uneventful weeks staffing a troop transport's Medicae bay before a boarding action turns those weeks into the hardest single night of your career so far. Alarms cut through the ship at 0300 hours, and within minutes your bay is receiving casualties from close quarters fighting in corridors 2 decks down, wounds unlike anything the Schola or your first 2 campaigns prepared you for, close-range blade trauma alongside las burns, men brought in through gravity that fails and returns without warning. You work through the night in conditions that make basic procedures newly difficult, holding an instrument steady through moments of weightlessness, adjusting a dressing on a man whose position keeps shifting as the deck's artificial gravity flickers. A senior Medicae officer running the bay barks corrections at you between casualties, and you absorb them the way you absorb the lessons from your first senior medic, filing each one away for the next crisis rather than dwelling on the one currently in front of you. The boarding action ends before dawn, and your bay has stabilized 11 of the 14 casualties brought through its doors, a ratio the senior Medicae officer calls, with visible surprise, better than she expected from a bay half-staffed by troopers still new to void combat medicine. You spend the rest of the voyage learning the specific differences between treating a wound in open ground and treating one in a sealed metal compartment, where the air itself can turn against you if the wrong systems fail. Knowledge that has no application anywhere except exactly here, and that you will nonetheless carry for the rest of your service. The senior Medicae officer requests you for her permanent bay staff before the transport reaches its next destination, a request your captain grants after some negotiation, and you spend the following year splitting duty between ground campaigns and void transit, becoming, without planning for it, one of the few medics in your regiment equally comfortable treating a wound in an open trench and one in a compartment where the floor cannot be trusted to stay where gravity left it. Level 5, the Siege. The front stalls into a siege in your 4th year, and the wounds waiting for you there look almost nothing like the ones from open battle. Trench foot spreads through your company within the first month, a slow rot born from standing water and boots that never fully dry, and you spend as much time treating this quiet, unglamorous damage as you spend treating anything caused directly by the enemy. A gas attack in the 2nd week adds chemical burns and ruined lungs to the list. Casualties that arrive in waves rather than one at a time, more than your supplies were ever stocked to handle at this rate. You learn to stretch what you have across a siege that shows no sign of ending, rationing counterseptic and stim injectors the way the quartermaster rations food, prioritizing the wounds most likely to return a man to the line over wounds that, however painful, will heal, regardless of whether you spend scarce supplies on them today. This calculation does not come easily. You make it anyway, dozens of times over 4 months, because a siege does not pause its casualties to let you feel conflicted about the arithmetic. An officer 3 trenches down develops a fever in the 3rd month that you diagnose, correctly, as the early stage of an infection, spreading quietly through several dugouts before anyone else notices the pattern. You isolate the affected sections and requisition what antiseptic the company can spare, a decision made entirely on your own judgment that likely prevents the infection from crippling half the line. Nobody outside the Medicae section hears about this specific save. You have stopped expecting them to by this point in your service, and the not hearing about it no longer costs you anything the way it might have 3 years earlier. The siege finally breaks in its 5th month, and you spend the last week before the push treating a fresh wave of casualties from the closing assault, while simultaneously packing your section's remaining supplies for a redeployment nobody has confirmed yet. A junior medic assigned to your section 3 months earlier asks you, during a rare quiet stretch, how you decide what to trust your own judgment on versus what to escalate to a surgeon further back. You tell her honestly that the line moves the longer you do this work, and that the only real answer is to stay honest with yourself about which side of it you are actually standing on in any given moment. Level 6. The Unknown Wound. Your regiment redeploys against a Xenos incursion in your 5th year, and the first wounded man brought to you from that engagement presents an injury nothing in your training remotely prepared you for. Tissue damage from a weapon whose biology and chemistry your Medicae manuals simply do not cover. You improvise, drawing on the closest analog you can think of from years of treating chemical burns and unfamiliar trauma, and the improvisation works well enough to stabilize him for transport to a proper surgical team further back. This becomes the pattern for the rest of the campaign. Xenos weaponry produces wounds your training was never built around, and you spend the engagement building a working, unofficial understanding of injuries nobody back at the Schola has ever documented, passing notes to the other medics in your battalion so nobody else has to solve the same problem from nothing the way you did on that first casualty. A senior Medicae officer collects these notes at the campaign's end for the sector's medical archive, crediting the battalion's medics collectively, rather than any one name specifically, which is exactly how you expected it to go, and exactly how it has always gone. You finish the campaign having learned an entirely new category of medicine that exists nowhere in any manual, carried now only in the hands and memory of the medics who lived through building it in real time, under fire, with no other option available. Level 7. The Mass Casualty Line. By your 7th year, you have run enough triage lines that your company's officers default to your judgment during any engagement large enough to produce casualties faster than your section can individually process them. And the largest single test of that trust comes during an assault that goes badly wrong in its opening minutes, artillery landing short of its target and catching 2 platoons still forming up. 40 wounded men arrive at your position within 20 minutes, more than your entire Medicae section has ever handled at once. You organize the chaos the only way you know how, sorting casualties into 3 lines by the same logic drilled into you a decade earlier and refined across every campaign since. Treat immediately, treat when able, and the wounds beyond what the situation allows you to address. You run the middle line personally, moving between a dozen men in rotation, buying time for the worst cases, while your section works through the ones with better odds, a rhythm that holds for nearly 2 hours before reinforcement Medicae teams finally arrive to relieve the pressure. 31 of the 40 survive the 2 hours before proper relief arrives, a number the company's Medicae officer calls, reviewing it afterward, close to the ceiling of what any single triage line could realistically have achieved under those conditions. You do not feel like celebrating the number. You feel, mostly, the specific exhaustion of having spent 2 hours making the same impossible calculation over and over, and the quiet relief of finally sitting down once the last casualty is out of your hands. The regiment's senior Medicae officer visits your section personally in the days after, not to commend you exactly, but to ask detailed questions about how you organize the 3 lines under that much pressure, and takes notes that eventually become part of how the sector trains its own medics for exactly this scenario. You answer the questions plainly, the way you have answered every question about your work for a decade, aware that the answers will outlast your own memory of the specific afternoon that produced them. Level 8. The Last Campaign. 2 decades into your service, You have trained more junior medics than you can count individually, each one arriving with the same nervous uncertainty you once carried into your first firefight. And you have come to genuinely enjoy the part of the job that involves watching someone else's hands finally stop shaking over a wound the way yours once did. Your final campaign takes your regiment to ground that reminds you, more than you expect it to, of that very first agri-world, another siege, another line of wounded men arriving faster than any single medic could hope to process alone. A young medic beside you freezes during the opening exchange of the campaign's worst engagement, exactly the way you once did, and you step into the gap without needing to think about the decision, working through 2 casualties in the time it takes her to recover her composure and rejoin the line. She thanks you afterward, and you tell her what your own senior medic told you decades earlier, that the freeze happens to everyone once, and what matters is what you do the second time. You take a wound of your own in the campaign's final week, shrapnel through the hand that leaves you unable to hold a suture needle steady enough to trust with a soldier's life. The regiment's own Medicaid board reviews your file and reaches the conclusion you already suspected, that your years of field service are finished, and offers you the same choice every veteran in your position eventually faces: invalid registration back on your home world, or resettlement as a colonist on ground your kind of regiment helped pacify further up the front. You take the second option, and spend your first weeks there teaching the settlement's newly appointed chirurgeon the same triage principles that kept you and hundreds of others alive across 2 decades of campaigns. You leave the regiment carrying nothing on paper beyond a service record and a hand that will never hold a needle steady again. But the actual weight of what you carry sits somewhere else entirely. In every medic you trained, every triage line you organized in the worst minutes of some stranger's life, every soldier walking around some corner of the Imperium today only because your hands found their wound before it found them first. The war moves on without you, the way it always does, but it moves on carrying a little more of what you taught it about staying alive. If this kind of story is your thing, hit like and subscribe for more, and let me know in the comments which rank or role you want to see next.